Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Black Collective podcast as part of the Reach Network here at Ipsos UK. My name is Barbara and I'm your host for today. In this episode, we're continuing with our discussion on the diaspora and cultural disconnect. In part one, our panel shared their personal stories and identified characteristics of disconnection in the diaspora experience. If you missed part one, please check it out on Spotify. In part two, we're going to explore the social impact of the disconnect and how to bridge the gap from our guest's perspective. But before we delve into the topic, once again, we're going to start with the introductions. So once again, I'll kick off. My name is Barbara. I work in customer experience, in insights, and I was born and bred in Zimbabwe. I've been living in this country for nearly 20 years.
And I am Deqa Jama. I'm a semiotics consultant in our advisory side of the business. And yeah, very much diaspora, British, living for half my life, born in Denmark, from several places in East Africa. And that'll be me. Over to you, Aron.
Hi, I'm Aron. I'm part of the strategy consultancy team here at Ipsos. And I'm, born and bred in the UK, but of Jewish heritage. Both my parents are also Jewish heritage. So pretty excited to be here.
And I'm Anu. I am also part of CX within the Insights team. And I was also born and raised in the UK.
When we started talking about this subject, we started by defining what diaspora means. And we talked about how it implies scattering and dispersion, a separation, if you like, from a group or community. So do we experience a disconnect? Do you have any examples?
I think it's very difficult to not be disconnected when you're from more than one place. And I think it's always going to be hard to navigate where you belong to most. We're not 50-50 anything. Even when we take out nationality and heritage, just womanhood and race or anything else. Like there's always, you can't be half of something. It's situational. So there's certain situations where I might be more connected to my ethnicity than where I live. And there are other times where I do feel more connected to where I live rather than where I'm from ethnically.
Oh, that's interesting. Would you like to elaborate a little bit in terms of?
I guess language would be one where I'm probably slightly more connected to where I am, because even though I speak native in several languages, I use English the most. That is the one that comes out the most. So it's a struggle to kind of turn it back when I go back home, for example. And equally, when I come back, it takes a minute to not put in ethnic words when I come back. So, and again, in times where I'm more connected to the motherland, I mean, racism, period, just all of that. So I guess, it's very situational for me.
Yeah, it is interesting how sometimes I find myself wanting to illustrate or explain something, and then a Shona word comes out instead of an English word. And then I have to remind myself that no, the people around me cannot understand what I'm saying. Sorry, Anu, you wanted to say something.
No, it's interesting how we've kind of touched on language, because I can't speak a word. Well, I can, but it's not fluent, and people what did you say? When I was speaking, you didn't say that properly. I get corrected. Even though I understand the language, I can't speak Yoruba, by the way. I can't speak fluently or pronounce words properly. So I'll say that's where I experienced the biggest disconnect, because you always get teased like, you're British, you're not Nigerian. Always get teased. Yeah, always get teased.
I find that when, so I speak the language, Shona, fluently, but But where I find a bit disconnected is because I've lived in this country for so long. The language or the slang evolves over time. And so when my cousins or my nieces are saying something like in slang, half the time I don't understand what they're talking about. So I feel that disconnect in that sense where I can't join in, or I will say something that is so outdated and they'll just laugh. Yeah.
Aaron, what's your Hebrew saying?
Oh yeah.
I think the language thing is quite interesting because I've always described the fact that I can read Hebrew but phonetically but not understand it as probably the most useless skill that I have. I think from a personal perspective, I feel quite a strong connection with the UK, with Britishness. I probably would put my Britishness before my Judaism, and my Judaism in terms of as an ethnic identity. But that is very much a personal thing, and varies massively between, I'd say, Jews within the UK, of where they would describe themselves as British Jews, or Jews who happen to be who happen to be based in the UK.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good time to say we don't speak for all Jewish people and Black people in this space. We are coming from our own experiences and how we see and perceive the world around us.
Yeah, so you mentioned stereotypes, or it's come up in the discussion. What are the common examples of stereotypes that you have experienced, or I dare say subjected others to?
We could start with the very obvious talking white. So I've often been told that I sound like a white girl, and it can be quite damaging because it says essentially that speaking with, I guess, proper words and putting your words together in a proper way is white centric, and it makes it as though speaking properly can only come from white people. It's interesting because this doesn't just come from white people, it comes from Black people too. And it just shows when these stereotypes can be so ingrained in us. And it's the same with gender, like misogyny can be ingrained in women too. And the same way with race, it can be very ingrained in ourselves. And when we take on these structural thinkings and these structural concepts that essentially are born from white supremacy, that's when we end up with very racist stereotypes. I have a question. I have a question for you, Aron, which is when it comes to stereotypes around Jewishness, do you think that those who aren't visually presenting as Jewish are perceived by non-Jewish people as being less Jewish? And is there stereotypes around that?
I think if you are dressed in a more traditional form, probably expressing any type of religion, you're probably going to be more likely to be targeted of more of that attacks, whether that's anti-Islam, anti-Semitism. And I do think there is definitely an element of, if you are dressed in a more stereotypical way in terms of like let's say look how I present myself, you probably wouldn't be able to tell straight away that I was necessarily of Jewish faith. And I think, yes, you definitely have an element of kind of going under the radar in terms of how people treat you, and potentially some of the kind of negative ways that people would kind of address you and stereotype you. And I think, in particular, being, a white as well, being that's a particular thing with Judaism, where there is that idea that you kind of blend in and blend out. So definitely, I think it's fair to say that the more that you conform in how you dress and how you look, the less of an obvious target you are for discrimination. Yeah,
definitely. And I think the thing that underpins that stereotype, which is quite difficult to navigate when it comes to Jewish people, is the conditional whiteness of being Jewish, because often a lot of Jewish people do look white, but I guess the white card can be revoked from them at any point by the dominant white, quote unquote. I think as well, like that's like a really good note to like just look at like Blackness in terms of politics. because that is another stereotype, that when we're in the diaspora, we're all assumed to hold the same political opinion. And so like the idea of being politically Black and the idea of just being Black and political are very different. And often that nuance isn't really cleared up. And like we see that with people like Kwasi Kwarteng, and like whenever they don't adhere to what being politically Black means as values. And when we look at what being politically Black is as a value, it's really about that larger shared diaspora, community-based values, driven political views. And yeah, that's very different from just being Black and political, because that's just someone who has political views and happens to be Black. And I think it's very important to note that just because we're from the diaspora, just because we're Black, we don't, I mean, not everybody agrees with each other. We don't all come from the same experiences. Yeah. We're going to have Tories, we're going to have leftists, we're going to have all sorts.
I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and there are certain things that, like, at a certain age, you are expected to be able to do certain things like chores or whatever. Maybe family or relatives come to visit, and they see our children being raised in this country, but we are not like raising them in the same way, because obviously they're in a different environment. And
so they see, do you mean that they're seeing your parenting as uncultured, even though it's not?
Or just concluding that the children are less cultured because of the way. I don't know. Maybe we need to cut all of this out.
I think that was the point I was trying to get to when I was speaking. So it's weird how us looking out, so British people looking out or into the way we behave, act, talk, speak, eat in places we refer to as home, or spaces we refer to as home, we can sometimes view ourselves as more cultured. And then the other way around, they look at us as uncultured. Oh, you know, they've forgotten where they've come from. They've forgotten their values. They've left all of that behind. And funny enough, when I was out last week, Sunday, someone was mentioning how it's important to teach your kids the language from where you're from, because that's the thing that ultimately ties them to their ethnicity. And how it's very sad, because I know my children, it's very likely they will not speak Yoruba or even understand it, because I won't be able to speak it to them properly. And so it's that generation is cut off, basically. So yeah, I get what you're saying, Barbara, and I think it's definitely a real experience.
Yeah, I get it now. And like in my language, we have a word for that. And like that you call people, which is Deqa Jama. And Deqa Jama means return to culture. And so the idea is like a person is a Deqa Jama. It can be a noun, but it's also a thing that you do, go back, either whether you're sending your children or whether you go as an adult or whether you go as a family, to go back home and be recultured. And Aaron, I think there's this similar stuff in the Jewish community as well, with birthright trips and stuff like that, which is the way I see it, geared towards the same kind of trajectory.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's very easy to conflate Judaism with Israel, and trying to like balance the two is quite interesting, because, you know, from a perspective of growing up, you know, there's a pressure within my family to like teach me the ways of Judaism so I can continue like Jewish traditions in terms of religious sense, in terms of a cultural sense. And part of that is by having, connection with Israel. So as you mentioned, there are things like birthright trips. So if you're Jewish and you haven't been to Israel by the time you're 18, you get to go. A lot of Jewish people who live in the diaspora at the age of 16 will go on like a teenager trip with part of youth movements. They'll go to Israel. And again, so by doing that, by going to Israel, you're building a connection with Israel, the country, and also with your own Judaism. So obviously there's a massive interlink between, you know, your Judaism, your religion, your ethnicity, identity, and the country of Israel, but also they're not the same. So that's kind of an interesting thing to kind of, but definitely there is pushes to kind of evolve your understanding of the ethnicity, and then that by association through the country of Israel as well.
Yeah, it's definitely very complex, because I mean, I don't know of any other culture that's an ethno kind of faith. that where they're so closely linked, like it's almost it's really difficult to take apart which part is the nationality, which part is the faith.
Yeah, what's the religious beliefs, what's the ethnicity, and then you've also got this country which I do have an affiliation and affinity for, which we're describing as, for the purpose of this, I'm the diaspora from that country. But none of my parents were born in that country. That country's only existed in its conventional sense since 1948. And none of my grandparents are from Germany, right? They're not from this, this original homeland that we're talking. But there is still a connection there. And the Jewish diaspora is in relation to Israel. So you've got a diaspora based on a country which is not like your parents and grandparents, but you're going to have to go back to maybe the Roman era and potentially coming out from that.
I was just wondering, this is a question for Anu. When maybe elderly relatives have come to visit, maybe from Nigeria or wherever, have you had these kind of stereotypes like spoken or even?
Yeah, I think that just goes back to my point of when I was saying myself looking outwards would think, that's old, they're too stuck in their ways, that's traditional, they need to move more towards, the modern day thinking. Or them looking at me could say, she's totally abandoned where she's come from. Because I've had people. So I think we also see stereotypes here as well, because they assume that I would be unmannered. I would have no manners. I would be rude. I wouldn't respect the elderly.
Lazy.
Lazy.
That's another word.
Not hardworking. Not serious about education.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is, sorry, go on.
I was just going to tie back to when Deqa was speaking about politics and political identities and views, and how just because we may all be black, white, whatever, we're just grouped as, they'll think this way, almost predictable. Deqa, I believe you were mentioning earlier about how, we see this a lot when elections are coming up, about how this candidate has definitely secured the black vote. But what does that mean? What does that mean?
And that's
we don't
always
all think
tying
the
back
same,
to that diaspora united kind of values, but we don't all share that. And like, I think there's something to be said about Nigeria being more advanced economically than a lot of African countries. And therefore a lot more access to education, a lot more access to not becoming diaspora, but leaving the country to study and come back to serve the country, more than I've seen anyways with a lot of other African countries. And when that happens, because they don't have that element of, when you're in Nigeria, you're not black, you're just Nigerian, right? There is no, I am black, you're just Nigerian. You might be Igbo, you might be Yoruba, you might be whatever, but like you're not, blackness isn't really a real concept when we're in Africa. So there's more leeway to kind of, when you have that kind of economic ability to kind of cement yourselves in different spaces, people can be, Tories, left-wingers, obviously these are English kind of conceptions, but politically speaking, have different opinions, and that not be a thing that has to be shared because of some hunger, because of some like shared thing that needs to be organized around, I guess, liberation. There's a lot less of that in Nigeria, I'd say, than a lot of other countries. And so a lot more freedom when they're in the diaspora. Most black Tories that I've seen were probably Nigerian. and I think that might have something to do with that kind of economic advancement and the ability to be able to develop different views and opposing views and have that, I guess, melting pot within Nigeria to begin with. And I think, though, like on that note, when it comes to stereotypes, just to kind of tie that up, it's interesting that like the negative stereotypes are the ones that kind of prevail, because there's one interesting one about Nigeria, which is specifically about Igbo boys, wherever they are in the diaspora, tend to be more intelligent than most of their peers. And nobody knows why. There's no real why to this. Somebody needs to investigate.
Is it actually a thing?
it's a thing. It's a thing. Like, as in, it's recorded a thing, but nobody has the why behind it.
Right.
And like, there's no like economic correlation. Like, it's a thing that we've noticed, but not enough research to ascertain the why.
So I suppose by identifying and acknowledging these common stereotypes associated with diaspora individuals, as again researchers, we can approach our work with a more nuanced and informed perspective, and this can help build trust with our clients and ensure that our work is inclusive and reflective of the communities we are studying, because we do study all communities. We are Ipsos. We study all communities. So, and recognizing and addressing those stereotypes in future projects can help us ensure that we are not perpetuating harmful biases in our research and insight by taking such steps like to actively combat the stereotypes and ensure inclusivity in our work. We can actually set strong foundation for future projects with clients from diverse backgrounds and other markets as well. Right. So what can we do to bridge the gap? Do we want to bridge the gap? Is it possible to do it?
What is the gap?
What is the gap? Maybe we need to start with, what is the gap?
Yeah, I was going to say it's very hard to define the gap because I think it's a personal experience it's very personal, and the diaspora and the disconnect manifests itself in different ways for different people. I think you've summed it up perfectly, Barbara. I think the gap is just the disconnect in every space or place that you find yourself in. And I think we need to move away from believing ignorance is bliss and that, we're just a very diverse country filled with people from multiple various backgrounds, and understand that we need to delve into those differences and realize that we need to it's not accommodate, it should just be the norm. It should just be standard to make sure everybody's welcome. I believe in the last episode, we touched upon names and the way they're pronounced. And I think a good example of bridging the gap was when I was in secondary school. A teacher of mine had to, I think it was an open day or something where the new intake were coming in. What is it called? An induction? Yeah, an induction day.
Induction day.
Yeah, were coming in, and he was given the role of calling out names to call out various names or a list, I don't know. And he noticed that there were quite a few Nigerian names that he wouldn't be able to pronounce. So he called myself and a friend of mine who was also Nigerian and said, could I just grab 15 minutes of your time? And if you could just show me or teach me how to pronounce these names, so that one, he doesn't make a fool of himself, but also it's not nice to to hear a complete remixed version of your name. And I thought that was really nice of him, and it's not hard to do.
Exactly.
And again, just moving away from ignorance is bliss. It's not always bliss.
It's bliss for the person who it doesn't affect.
That's true. That's true.
I feel like having like conversations with people from different backgrounds, from different experiences, can go so much to understanding how you can bridge the gap and how people's their different perceptions. The amount of proverbial water cooler conversations I have with Deqa, where we share our different experiences, and she empathizes, and that the amount of empathy that she must have gained from things that I go through, and the empathy that I've gained from her has been massive. Recommending each other books. I remember when we came in that day and it was like, you just finished Jews Don't Count by Dave Baddiel. I think I just read Natives by Akala, and we were like sharing crib notes of like interesting things that we had learned from them, and how what that means for us moving forward, and how we'll kind of view different situations. So any curiosity that you can have and any conversations you can have with people that come from different backgrounds. So it goes a massive way to bridging the gap. And Ipsos does actually a really good job with this thing, you know, versus other places. And I'm not normally one to shout out for no reason, but you know, like when we had the authority gap talk with Kelly, and the last Reach talk that I went to that Deqa hosted as well.
Oh yes, I was there. It was brilliant. If anyone hasn't watched it, please check it out. It's brilliant. Yeah.
What
yes.
Aaron just said was perfect.
Yes. Perfect.
And I think that's
get
like
fired.
the nugget. I really do think that's the nugget. Like, how do we bridge the gap? Really, is understanding from what all three of you have said. And it really is about also understanding like the intersections of our identities. Like the diaspora experience is so much more complex than just I am Black British or I am whatever, right? And it's usually several cultures coming together, usually three or more coming together. And because something that you said, Anu, which was like everyone's experience is different. Like my Blackness is different because I've lived in Denmark. My Blackness is different from someone who's even from my ethnicity and is a third culture kid in this country. Other Nigerians who have had other experiences would have entirely different intersections of identity to you, Anu, and same with the two of you. And I think that's what it is, like understanding that not all diaspora experiences are the same, and they're very much shaped by where we've been and where our parents have been in the world.
Yeah,
exactly.
You can't just look at one person and think they're going to give you the answer to that entire community's experience. And I think that's something that is still yet to be
the definition of ignorance
uncovered and solved.
I think what bridging the gap stems from building relationships, and not just and being very intentional about it as well. And so, like, for example, if I want to know about Aaron and his culture, I need to have those water cooler conversations with him, and actually take an interest in what he is saying, as opposed to just having an abstract view and start communicating that as fact, because that is just not how to build those relationships. And the way by building relationships, we get to be we get to empathize with one another, and we get to, I think, understand that we don't have to look the same. We don't have to sound the same. We are diverse. We are different. And that is a good thing. That is something to be celebrated rather than shunned upon.
Absolutely. And I think like intersections is, especially being diaspora, is so much more than just ethnicity as well. Like it's Ramadan now and I'm Muslim. And like it's nice, like you were mentioning, I knew someone came to you and like asking how do I pronounce the names. My line manager, Monique, she was like, so how do I wish people a nice Ramadan? Like like how do I say it and what can I, and that was really nice, because it was like you actually care of how you're saying it. You could have just said it however you wanted to, but she chose to let me just go and sense check that and do it right. And tying that again back to what we do as consultants, as researchers, when working on projects in other markets, it really is important to approach the research and the insights process with that cultural humility and recognize that we don't all have the answers or the insights, but by building relationships of trust and actively seeking out those learnings from our clients as well as our colleagues, we can create more meaningful and impactful research that reflects the perspectives and needs of different communities. And this can lead to stronger client relationships and more successful projects in the future, which is something we all want.
Well said, Deqa.
And so like going back to what Annie was saying, I think, experiences are very, very different for different members of the diaspora. There are people who are part of my specific ethnic community who wouldn't share my Muslim values, for example. And at the moment, we're going through times of Ramadan. And I know for other faith communities, there are also very interesting holidays and festivities and observations happening, both for Christians and for Jewish people. So I do think this is a good time to go through Passover and what the diaspora frame of thinking is around that. And we have our lovely Aaron here who will talk us through that.
Thanks, Deqa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Passover. So Passover is a Jewish festival which tells the story of the Exodus, which is the Jews leaving Egypt. So the Jewish people were enslaved by Pharaoh, by the Egyptians, and Moses, using the Ten Commandments, freed the Jews who then went into the desert and received the Ten Commandments. That is a very, very quick overview. I do recommend that you watch The Prince of Egypt if you want to get a full version of the story of Exodus. But I think
so good.
It's so good. But I think what's powerful about the story is that it's all about the Jewish people like not being belonged, being enslaved in this within Egypt. And even though the historical accuracy and reliability of some of the biblical stories is subjective, there are definitely real incidences from that. Jewish expulsion from England in the 13th century, Spanish Inquisition, more recently, like 19th century pogroms. Like, Jewish history is full of Jewish people not feeling wanted, being victimized, even being genocided, relatively recently. And what that means from a diaspora perspective is that narrative probably goes a long way to making Jewish people feel less connected to the country that they're in and more connected to Israel, even though, again, a lot of them, myself included, have not been born in Israel, don't have any like family connection to Israel. So I'd say Passover and those stories and those festivals and the subsequent historical realities go a long way to shaping diaspora identity in terms of, I think Jewish people, there's always this idea that you might not be welcome for like that little bit longer, right? You never know when something might take a turn and you have to pack your bags and go. And that's, based off thousands of years of historical reality. So even though, it's very easy to look at, now in terms of a more comfortable position versus, let's say, the more comfortable position, the reality is that there's always that fear. And that comes from Passover. So I'd be interested to get your views on kind of your diaspora experience and how welcome you feel, and whether that then pushes you towards what is, a homeland, if there is a homeland, or, Britain is obviously, firstly, Britain is my homeland anyway, so I wouldn't actually refer to Israel in that way. But yeah.
I think before we get into that, an important thing to say is as well, there's so many, talking of intersections and diaspora identities being complex, there are so many Black Jewish people who will also be celebrating Passover. And then that extra marginalization of everything that you were saying, Aaron, which is being expelled from many different places in many different times in history. There's also that element of Black people, even today, people from where I'm from, Ethiopians who are Jewish, who travel to Israel to celebrate and, I guess, observe this season, who don't feel welcome even in Israel. So there's so many intersections to the diaspora experience.
Wow, this is a big subject.
And a complex one.
A complex one. We could actually do a proper mini series, like 6-part series on it, and still have something to say.
No, but I think that goes back to the point of just listening to everyone's story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why when we talk about Passover as well, I think it's important to remember that being expelled isn't something that's ended. It depends on who it is, where it is, how it is, but it's definitely not over. And that's like, that makes me think of like the frame of thinking that this all lives in, right? Like whether it's a distant past or a recent past, like these things have an effect. Even if we haven't directly experienced something in particular, it still carries on and like affects us. My friend who's Black and Jewish, she works at a synagogue where most people are white, like she's the only Black person there. But when people come in, because she doesn't come across Jewish visually. So when she's in there, everyone in there does look visibly Jewish, in what they wear and the characteristics of their hair, all sorts. So when the door opens and strangers come in, she sees them visibly freeze in ways that she doesn't. And again, she probably freezes more outside the synagogue than a lot of them would. So it's, again, that experience is so nuanced, and this topic is so complex in how people experience it.
It is. Yeah. Our experiences are so different, and yet there are intersections. I remember because we were colonized by the British, Zimbabwe was colonized by the British. I remember there was a time when there were toilets where there would be for white people and for Black people in my country. My sister went to a school where it was an all white, only white people were allowed to go to that school until after about I think post-independence, but there was still a lot of racism. So they were actually known as A schools. A schools were for predominantly white people, and B schools were for everybody else.
Wow, so even in the AA, there's hierarchy.
Exactly. And even, and I won't even go into the land issue because that's another whole other topic. Yeah. So this is reality.
It is. And yeah, that really does take us to like recognizing and respecting that diversity of culture and religious practices in diaspora really is so crucial, and especially when working on research projects that touch on these topics. And if we understand the ways in which those communities may approach or interpret these practices, and even more granular than communities, individuals, we can ensure that our research is culturally responsive and relevant and can lead to more accurate and insightful research outcomes, as well as stronger client relationships and more opportunities, again, which is something we all want.
Yes.
And just hanging off to your last words, Barbara, about when you were saying that this is reality, I think one key thing I'm taking away from today is that just because it's not my reality doesn't mean it's not reality or somebody else's reality. And just remaining open-minded, even though I would place myself as part of the people, communities, ideas that makes for a very diverse nation. My community is, sorry, I don't even know what I'm saying, but my community is also diverse. And just because someone looks like me, speaks like me, could have a very different day-to-day experience.
That's true.
I like that. Like my key takeaway for today. Maybe we should all do one. Like the key thing for our own experience.
It's purely just it's made me more motivated to have more conversations with people, with individuals, and understanding that these are such emotional and like powerful driving forces of like who individuals are. And I think like Annie made the point that you could have two people going through like the same experience and they'll come out of it with completely different perceptions of what their identity is and where they fit themselves versus homeland, diaspora, what they consider homeland versus diaspora. And that even amongst my friends with very, very similar life stories, are the way that we would talk about our connections to Judaism, Israel, Britain would be entirely different. And that's just within one microcosm, and then if you take into account if I was of Ethiopian origin, how different would that be? So just more conversations, just keep being curious and learning more from individuals and their experiences.
Love that. My one's similar, I guess. My one is, I guess for me, I find it also important, and I think this is something like me and you, Aaron, be doing with our books sharing sessions, is sometimes it can be quite exhausting to ask somebody questions that you could have just read about. And the thing for me is when it comes to things I don't understand and cultures that I don't understand, and even intersections of diaspora experiences within my own community, because I mean, my dad was born in Ethiopia. There are so many Ethiopian Jewish people. I don't understand that experience. That's not my experience. There are Ethiopian Christians, Orthodox Christians. I don't understand their experience. So like taking the time to do the reading is actually the best way to come into a conversation, not just coming into the conversation, which I think is quite important. That's my little takeaway. Barbara, what's yours?
I think my takeaway is everything that you've said, each of you.
Cop out.
And I mean, just not making assumptions, about people, not making an effort to say, hey, how are you? Tell me about whatever, fill in the blanks. And getting to know people from that level, building relationships, like in CX, working customer experience. So we are big on, helping our clients to build relationships with their customers. And I think we can practice that even within the workplace, with our colleagues. We can I mean, it's a bit more difficult now with a hybrid model, but those times when we do meet in person, let's make an effort to get to know one another. Thank you everyone for tuning in, for listening to our podcast.
And that's a wrap for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. And we hope you've enjoyed the discussion. And if you want to have a chat with us around the office and join our cultural cooler conversations, feel free to do so. And yeah, keep an eye out for our next episode. And you can reach us on, Barbara, where can they reach us?
On UK-reach-the Black Collective at ipsos.com.